Chapter 8. It was one of those moments when the moral high ground opens and swallows you up. Paul looked down at the cowering goblin, buried up to the neck in the Journal of Meteorological Studies, and back at Mr. Tanner, and for a short time he forgot all about Sophie and the weirdness, and the fact that he'd just fought a giant orc, as he was already thinking of the goblin, to a standstill, and with nothing but a stapler. He felt like he was 10 years old, and he'd just been caught trying to hide the shards of the priceless Ming vase he'd used to smash the drawing-room window. "What are you doing here, anyway?" Mr. Tanner said. "It's nearly 6 o'clock. You shouldn't even be in the building." Sorry," Paul said automatically, and then it occurred to him that somewhere about the premises a horrible hairy creature with a face like a weasel was holding a knife to Sophie's throat. Somehow the risk of getting fired didn't seem quite so important. "Sophie," he said, "they've got her. One of the—" He hesitated. If this one was Mr. Tanner's mother, the knife wielder might be his cousin or his aunt. "Grabbed her," he said. "Stuck a knife under her chin. You've got to do something." Mr. Tanner sighed, as if he'd just been called out of an important meeting to sign a stationery requisition. "I see," he said. "All right, stay here and try not to cause any more trouble." He went back through the fire door. Paul noticed that he was still holding the stapler. He put it carefully down on the front desk and then looked around. The goblin, Mr. Tanner's old mum, was still crouching on the floor, watching him with baleful, terrified eyes. I'm sorry," he said, and held out a hand to help it up. But it made a tiny, brittle, screaming noise like worn-down brake shoes and shrank away. About a minute later, Mr. Tanner came back. Sophie was behind him, with a dazed expression on her face, but no blood or anything. Paul wanted to rush over and fold her in his arms, but he had enough sense left to realise this wouldn't be a good idea. "Sit down," Mr. Tanner barked at her, and she dropped obediently into the receptionist's chair. "And you," he added to Paul. Then he knelt down beside the book-entombed goblin, gently held out his hand, and screamed at it like a monkey in a zoo or a mynah bird. The goblin screamed back, grabbed his wrist, and hauled itself up, taking great and ostentatious care to keep Mr. Tanner between itself and Paul. Slowly, tenderly, Mr. Tanner walked it across reception, holding it gently by the arm, then opened the door for it. The goblin paused in the doorway, pointed at Paul with a long, wickedly curved claw, and shrieked. Mr. Tanner nodded and shrugged, then closed the door after it. "Right," he said, turning and facing them. It was that last nod and shrug that did it. They'd reminded him of when he was 6 or 7, at which point in his spiritual development he'd had to put up with weekly visits to Auntie Pauline's, where he was invariably sent out into the garden to play with his obnoxious 5-year-old cousin Gary. Every week it had been the same. As soon as Gary got bored with whatever game they were playing, he'd favour Paul with an evil grin, burst into hot, wet tears, and run howling in through the French windows, bellowing, "Mummy, he hit me," at the top of his precociously loud voice. Every week, Mum and Dad and Aunt Pauline and Uncle Terry would accept the little bastard's version without question, and Paul would be spoken to and sent to sit in the car with nothing to eat or read till it was time to go home. And every time, as Paul was being led away to solitary confinement, Mum would look at Auntie Pauline and nod and shrug in precisely that way. Not this time, Paul decided. He jumped to his feet and yelled, "What the bloody hell is going on?" Mr. Tanner frowned at him, as though he was a spelling mistake. "Sit down and be quiet," he said, "and I'll tell you." "Oh, all right," said Paul, and he perched on the edge of the front desk. But he couldn't bring himself to let it go at that. He had to ask. "Mr. Tanner," he said, was that really your mother?" "Yes," said Mr. Tanner. "Fine," Paul said. "So, does that mean you're—" Mr. Tanner nodded. "A goblin, yes. If you want to be pedantic about it, I'm a quarter human on my father's side, but that's really none of your business." Sophie raised her head and stared at him. She still looked as though she'd followed a large white rabbit with a pocket watch down a hole in the ground, but some colour was starting to return to her cheeks. "Mr. Tanner," she asked quietly, "why are there goblins in this building?" Mr. Tanner sighed. "They own it," he said. Sophie opened her mouth to say something, but didn't. Mr. Tanner pulled up a chair from the waiting area, sat down and lit a cigar. "I suppose it's our fault, really," he said. Actually, it's something of a bone of contention in the partnership right now. Some of us feel that when we take on trainees, we ought to put them in the picture right away, to avoid god-awful fuck-ups like this one. Others like to see it as a sort of rite of passage, come intelligence test. If you're bright enough to work for J.W.Wells, you ought to be able to figure it out for yourselves. He flashed one of his trademark unpleasant grins. Nice idea, he said, but with the calibre of the recruits we have to make do with nowadays, probably a bit unrealistic. He drew hard on his cigar and blew a smoke ring. Anyhow, he went on, I think the best way to explain it to you is like this. He reached in his pocket and took out some folded sheets of paper, handing one each to Sophie and Paul. At first sight, it looked like the firm's standard letterhead, but then Paul noticed an extra line of fine print just below the company name and logo. J.W.Wells & Co. Supernatural Consultants, Paranormal Engineers, Practical Metaphysicians. Found it? Mr. Tanner said. Splendid. Now, I'd like you to look at the partners' names on the right-hand side, under the by appointment symbol. After each name, you'll see a string of letters, qualifications. You don't need to be told that. Got it. Paul looked across. The list read, John W. Wells, M.A.A., Oxon, L.L.B., F.I.P.E.S., Dip, N. Humphrey Wells, A.S.T.P., C.I.I.M. Professor Theodorus Van Spee, V.U.L., W.I.T., O.B.E. C.N. Suslovich, F.S.E.E., A.I.B.G. The Contessa Judith de Castelbianco, Q.F., F.R.I.C.S. Lieutenant Colonel Dietrich Wormtoter, R.H.G., F.I.C., D.G.B.I. Dennis Tanner, B.A., Plymouth, B.G. All right, Mr. Tanner said. Let's start at the top. M.A.A. stands for Master of Arcane Arts. F.I.P.S. means Fellow of the Institute of Practical and Effective Sorcerers. Dip-N is just Diploma in Necromancy, no big deal. You just fill in a form and send him a fiver and you got it by mail by return. Humphrey Wells, now, let's see. ASTP is Associate of the Society of Thaumaturgical Practitioners. CIIM is something like Confrère de l'Institut International de la Magique. They're a load of tossers if you ask me, but it impresses the French. And we're always told we've got to think Europe these days. Anyway, I can't remember what VULWIT stands for, and if I could, I couldn't pronounce it. Means Theo Van Spees is something or other professor of witchcraft at the University of Leiden, which probably means bugger all to you two. But take it from me, that's hot stuff in the trade. The OBE was for services to horticulture, and God only knows what he came to get that. Kaz Sochowicz, FSEE, is Fellow in the Society of Elemental Engineers. AIBG is just Associate of the International Brotherhood of Giants. You got that just by being born. Paul made a choking noise. Sorry, what was that? Giants, Mr. Tanner repeated. Kaz Suslowicz is a giant, ain't you? Nah, guess not. But he's a short giant, Mr. Tanner said firmly. Judy Castelbianco, that should be obvious even to you two. No, it isn't, Sophie said dangerously. QF, said Mr. Tanner. Queen Le Fay. You do know who the Fay are, don't you? Hint, you got them at the bottom of your garden. I don't mean a water feature. Rick Wormtoter, he's a Ritter des Heiligen Graals. That's Knight of the Holy Grail to you. And a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Dragon Slayers of Great Britain and Ireland. The Lieutenant Colonel is perfectly genuine too, if you count the Riders of Rohan as a proper army. And that's about it. What about you? Sophie growled. BG. Mr. Tanner beamed at her, revealing many unusual teeth. Boss Goblin, he said. There was a second or so of complete silence, and then Paul asked, Excuse me, what does it all mean? Mr. Tanner clicked his tongue. Come on, he said. Right, from the top. Humphrey Wells is a sorcerer. He does mostly commercial and banking these days, but he still keeps his hand in with the conjuring and raising spirits, mainly for the Far Eastern market in the States. Theo Bansby is probably the best wizard currently working in the private sector, space-time stuff principally, and a lot of consultancy work. And, of course, the whole of the information technology side. Kaz Suslowicz is almost entirely construction and civil engineering, as you'd expect. Judy, well, obviously she looks after our client portfolio in the entertainment sector. Rick Wormtoter is our resident hero. Basically, he does pest control, mostly dragons. Dragons, Paul repeated. Dragons. Even if you've heard of dragons. Yes, but they don't... Dragons. said Mr. Tanner wearily, are attached to accumulations of wealth. These days that's mostly museums, art galleries and, of course, banks. This week he's off dealing with a nasty infestation in the vaults of the Credit Lyonnese. They're hoping he can get shot at the buggers before the euro goes into free fall on Wall Street. And I'm a goblin, he added with a smirk. But you know that already. Paul knew Mr. Tanner was waiting for one of them to ask. He reckoned it might as well be him. What do goblins do? He said. Yeah. Mr. Tanner stubbed out his cigar on the leg of his chair and lit another. Goblins live in the bowels of the earth, digging vast tunnels that go down to the outer skin of the magma core. In other words, he went on, minerals, which means where I come from in New South Wales, bauxite, which, he added with a particularly nasty grin, is why I hired you. Paul's mouth flopped open. Me? You. You're a natural scryer, as you've just proved. 90% success rate. That's really very good. Paul didn't know what to say. You mean those photos of bits of desert? Mr. Tanner nodded. You looked at them, and instinctively you knew where the bauxite deposits were. Don't go getting ideas, though. That's what we're paying you for. You, on the other hand, he went on, looking at Sophie. Theo Van Spee reckons you've got what it takes to be a seer. Coming from him, that's a real compliment, and don't you forget it. I'm honoured, Sophie grunted, but I don't think I want to. Thanks. You don't want to, Mr. Tanner repeated. That's right. Mr. Tanner's face stretched into an enormous toothy grin, and Paul, staring at it in horrified fascination, reckoned he could definitely see the family resemblance. Tough, Mr. Tanner said. It's not up to you. Isn't it? Sophie replied. Nah, you signed a contract. Sophie laughed. Fine, she said. Sue me. I've got £60 in the bank and £15 and some pennies in the post office. Oh yeah, and premium bond. So you can have the lot for all I care, but I'm not coming back here again. Not ever. Mr. Tanner shook his head. Never sign a legal document without reading it, he said. Clause 3, paragraph 5. I can't remember the exact wording, but the gist of it is, if you try and quit, we can force you to work for us any way we choose. His eyes flashed red, just like his mother's. You really don't want to find out how we do that. Sophie shook her head. I don't believe you, she said. Really? Mr. Tanner shrugged. Then you leave me no choice, I'm delighted to say. Now then, when I snap my fingers 3 times, you're going to take all your clothes off and dance the dying swan. Ready? He clicked his fingers once, twice, 3 times, and at the third click the expression on Sophie's face suddenly changed from grim defiance to total and unspeakable horror. Her fingers spread out like starfish as she fought to keep her hands by her sides. Then they were at her throat, and she slowly undid the top button of her blouse. No, she whispered. Please. Mr. Tanner laughed. That was too much for Paul. He jumped up and reached for the stapler, but Mr. Tanner turned his head and looked at him. At once Paul felt an unbearable pain in his arm, as if someone had caught it in a huge pair of red-hot tongs and was pulling it towards his face. He watched as his index finger straightened and started to move inexorably towards and then up his left nostril. He could feel it reaming and twisting. All right! I'm sorry, he gasped. That's all right, Mr. Tanner said indulgently, and he snapped his fingers again. Simultaneously, Paul and Sophie felt their arms relax and flop to their sides. And that's me being nice, Mr. Tanner added. You're lucky I'm in a good mood. Sometimes I can be a bit of an old crosspatch, and I don't think you'd like that. Oh, and while I think of it, if you're toying with the idea of trying to involve the police, or the Industrial Tribunal, or the newspapers, or the Esther Ranson show, I wouldn't bother if I were you. Even if you manage to tell them about what you think just happened here, they won't believe you. But it wouldn't come to that, because the moment you opened your mouth or tried to post a letter or send the email, you'll find yourself crouched on the floor with your thumb in your mouth singing Give My Regards to Broadway. I take the view that being a really evil bastard isn't just a job, it's a vocation. Up to that point, if asked, Paul would have told you he knew perfectly well what being scared felt like. He knew scared from nothing, thank you very much. In fact, he could write a postgraduate thesis on it. Fear of heights, spiders flying, getting beaten up, getting caught, being late, being laughed at, earwigs, loud noises, pretty well anything you care to name except Mary Poppins and breakfast cereal. As he sat on the front desk and stared at Mr. Tanner, however, he realised that hitherto he had known about being scared the way a bumblebee knows about flying to Andromeda. A quick sideways glance told him that Sophie was thinking along much the same lines. Under other circumstances, finding something they had in common would have pleased him no end. On this occasion, it didn't seem all that significant. And anyhow, Mr. Tanner went on, You may think you want to pack it in, but you're wrong. Once you got over this daft little culture shock thing, you'll realise you've lucked into the most fantastic career anybody could ever wish for. Think about it, will you? You're going to be wizards. You're going to learn to do magic. There's 100 million kids from Saigon to Greenland who'd give their PlayStation for a chance like you've got. So, Mr. Tanner continued, smiling agreeably, let's have less of the long faces and more of the cheerful enthusiasm. Are we happy? Because if we aren't, he added, we soon will be. Well, we're happy, Paul and Sophie mumbled in unison. Are we excited? Looking forward to a whole galaxy of thrilling new opportunities? They nodded. That's all right then. Mr. Tanner stood up. Sorry if I've cut into your free time. I think this exercise has been useful. Now bugger off. Don't want to see you back here till 9 sharp on Monday. He crossed to the door and took out a bunch of keys. Ah, he said. One last thing. Particularly as far as you're concerned, Miss Pettingell. Goblins aren't all that different from people. Scare the shit out of them and you may find they get panicky. Leave them alone and they won't bother you. And it's particularly important you don't go getting the wrong side of any particular colony because, as I said a minute or so ago, they're actually our landlords here. They own it, let it to us like peppercorn rent, strictly on the understanding that we see to it that the doors are locked and they can come out of the tunnels where they live, run about, have a bit of harmless fun after a long day of digging one with their fingernails without bloody great big humans jumping out at them, frightening them after death. Not a lot to ask, I think you'll agree. Also, he added grimly, they happen to be family. And I'd like you to ask yourselves how you'd like it if some huge ugly monsters barge into your parents' lounge and start to shove them around. Really, it's just basic good manners and consideration for others. Understood? He unlocked the door and opened it for him. Right, he said. Off you go. Miss Pettingell, if you get to move on and don't dawdle, you'll find you're in plenty of time to catch 6:05 from London Bridge to Denmark Hill, which just happens to be running 20 minutes late. Means you should get to the Spaniel and Spigot just as the warm-up band's grinding to a halt, and I promise you won't have missed anything. He grinned and winked insultingly. Have a nice weekend, he said. Be good. The door closed behind them, and they could hear the keys gronching in the locks. It was just starting to rain. Well, Paul said. Sophie didn't answer. They walked a few steps and then paused. You heard him, Paul said. Hurry, or you'll miss your train. She looked at him. Rain was running off her forehead and down her nose, like fat tears. What are we going to do? She said. Paul shook his head. I haven't got a clue, he said. My dad's got an old Spanish proverb he's always quoting. When you're drowning in beef stew, it's a hell of a time to decide if you're a vegetarian. I'm not sure whether it applies to this or not, but it's the best I can manage right now. Sophie looked at him for a moment and then shrugged. Well, she said, see you Monday. Yes, right. Enjoy your pottery thing. Ceramics, she corrected him, and walked away. Paul took the only course of action open to him at that point in his career. He went to the nearest pub and drank 6 pints of lemonade shandy without the lemonade. When he asked for a 7th, the man behind the bar said he reckoned he probably had just about as much lemonade shandy as was good for him, and maybe he ought to go home. Paul thanked him, left the pub, found another, and ordered a pint of ginger beer shandy, without the ginger beer. When the barman asked him if he wouldn't rather just have a pint of lager instead, since it amounted to just about the same thing, Paul shook his head and replied no. He'd rather stick to shandy because he wasn't used to strong drink. And then he fell over, whereupon kind-hearted bystanders helped him out through the door and into the gutter. There he stayed for a while, considering his options and restructuring his priorities, until a policeman came along and arrested him. But Paul merely smiled. True. He'd just passed through unutterable horrors, and every aspect of his life had turned to cheap cooking shit between his fingers. But at least he didn't have to take that sort of nonsense from coppers. Not now that he was a wizard. First of all, he tried to explain. You can't arrest me, he said. I'm a wizard. The policeman admitted to a certain degree of scepticism. He advanced an alternative theory of his own and tried to grab Paul by the lapels. Paul brushed him aside, none too gently. You can't do that, he said. Not respectful. I'll give you one last chance and then... But the policeman didn't seem to want his last chance. A pity, but there's no helping some people. With a mild sigh of regret, Paul narrowed his eyes, took a deep breath, and clicked his fingers. It didn't seem to be working. Meanwhile, the policeman hadn't been idle. He'd got Paul up on his feet and was shoving him rather brusquely against a wall while unshipping his handcuffs. Paul was disappointed, to put it mildly. This wasn't what he'd been led to expect. Fat lot of good it was, being a wizard and being able to find books-like blindfold in the dark wearing boxing gloves, if you couldn't do a perfectly simple thing like ordering Porky Pig to eat his truncheon. Then he remembered, and suddenly it all became clear. He'd thought of the bit about the truncheon after he'd snapped his fingers. Well, there you are, he told himself, and tried again. For a moment, Paul had the nasty feeling that it still wasn't going to work. But then, just when he was beginning to get worried, the policeman let go of him, took a step back, and made a very faint mewing noise, like a cat inside a large suitcase. Then, in slow motion, like an action replay, he pulled the shiny black riot stick from his belt, lifted it to his mouth, and bit it. There was a faint pinging noise. In retrospect, Paul figured out it was probably a tooth breaking. "There you go," Paul said happily, as the policeman bit again. "Though if I was you, I'd try and spread it on toast, or with a couple of bits of bread. Truncheon meat, ha 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 ha." He grinned Mr. Tanner fashion. He'd never had a policeman for a straight man before. "Mind how you go," he said, and walked away, straight into a deep, oily puddle. The special providence that looks after cats and drunks got him home. He closed his door, flopped down on the bed, and went straight to sleep. He had a strange dream. In this dream, he fought a band of goblins, discovered he had unearthly magical powers, and forced a policeman to commit an undignified and painful act in public. While the dream was playing inside his mind, he found himself thinking that, even by his standards, this dream was as weird as the plumbing on the TARDIS. Then he woke up, and in a split second between the return of consciousness and the hangover spinning its wheels in the poisoned mush of his brain, he realised that it wasn't a dream. It was a memory. "Oh," he thought. "Jesus," he thought. "Did I really say truncheon meat? Not good. Not good at all." He stumbled out of bed, found the kettle, and filled it with water. Just for fun, instead of flipping the switch, he gave it a stern look, snapped his fingers, and said, "Boil." But nothing happened. Still, he hadn't expected that anything would. Maybe that was why it hadn't. Whatever. Thinking about it rationally and sensibly didn't really help. He'd got past the stage where he could kid himself that the various weird things he'd seen were hallucinations or unusually vivid dreams. Instead, he had to face the fact that he was living in a world where magic seemed to work. Goblins existed, and he was stuck in the cold eye of Weirdness Central without the option of running away. In theory, there was a positive side, since apparently he could do at least some bits of magic. He could immobilise policemen. Ever since he could remember, he'd been terrified of them. And so, also in theory, he could do pretty much what he liked without having to worry about being arrested and sent to prison. Fine, but even if this was true, when he came to think about it, he couldn't call to mind a single illegal thing he actually wanted to do. So maybe he could rob banks and have lots of money. A fat lot of good it'd do him, even if he got away with it, when he was obliged to turn up for work every day at 70 St Mary Axe and file printouts or play Spot the Box site all day, or else risk some imaginatively nasty penalty from the murky depths of Mr Tanner's imagination. Besides, he rationalised, there was probably a very good and obvious reason why the possessors of magical powers didn't go around helping themselves to anything they took a fancy to. Or else, why were the partners in the firm working for a living instead of swanning about enjoying themselves like a bunch of supernatural Cray brothers? It was more likely that the scope of his superpowers was severely limited. He'd be able to stare down one copper, for example, but not two, something like that. On balance, he decided, having magical powers would probably turn out to be rather like satellite TV. Sounds cool, turns out to be more hassle than it's worth. All that bothered him, for sure. But for most of the weekend, as soon as he allowed his mind to wander, Paul found his thoughts turning to Denmark Hill and wherever the trail led from there. The more he thought about that, the worse it got. For the last month, he realised, his whole life had been founded on one admittedly unlikely supposition. If I can woo and win this girl, I shall be happy ever after. He'd never for one moment believed that he could actually win, but at least he'd been in the race, in contention. Now, at a stroke, he was out of it. She'd found someone else. No vacancies. The position's been filled. Go away. Not just that, thanks to Mr. Tanner and his horrible associates, he was condemned to go on seeing her every day, spending hours on end in the same room with her, when what he really should be doing was putting as much distance between himself and her as he possibly could. He knew the drill. He'd been turned down often enough. If he could quit his job and get another one, it was £1 to a chocolate euro that within a matter of days he'd light on some other unsuspecting female who happened to meet his not too exacting criteria and fall hopelessly in love with her. No problem. That was his natural defence system. A series of rebounds as quick and complex as the highest level on a pinball table. Unfortunately, that option didn't seem to be open. The best he could do would be to fall for someone else at J.W., and he didn't hold out much hope in that direction, for the simple reason that if there'd been anybody suitable on the premises, he'd have done so already. But who was there? The secretaries were either notoriously spoken for or far too glamorous and beautiful to offer him the tiny glimmer of hope that was a prerequisite for crush acquisition. It had always been the same. The ones Paul fell for tended to be boot-faced, bespectacled, a tad too fat or too skinny to slot neatly into the conventional stereotype of womanly beauty. It was, he'd admitted to himself, the difference between hunting for the rainbow's end and buying a lottery ticket every week. Neither path was ever going to make him a rich man, but doing it his way, at least he had a 1 in 50 million chance, and that was enough. But, all right then, Mr. Wise Guy, why do fools fall in love? There had to be a reason. About the only thing Paul still remembered from school science lessons, aside from various interesting things that happen when you mix iodine and ammonia, was Darwin's theory. Evolution. It was something he couldn't help taking personally. Gradually, over 10,000 dark millennia, everything necessary had been designed and installed, everything useful had been adopted, everything harmful and unhelpful had been pared away. Sometimes he fancied he could almost hear the thoughts of those successive generations of prototypes trudging wearily up the steep path of progress with nothing to keep them going except the instinctive knowledge that their effort and unselfish sacrifice would someday lead to the ultimate, the final version that couldn't be improved on. Himself, Paul Carpenter. It would be an unforgivable insult to their memory to assert that any design feature comprised in his physical or mental makeup wasn't there for the very best of reasons. The same sequence of processes that brought about such miracles of engineering as bones, muscles, blood and brain had also shaped his instincts and emotions. Inevitably, therefore, the software had to be as perfect in its way as the hardware. Accordingly, there had to be a reason for the apparently loopy way he carried on around girls. It had to be some kind of survival skill or behavioural trait optimised for the greater glory of the species. Nature had included it in the package for a purpose, but he was buggered if he could see what on earth it might be. And by the same token, there had to be an equally good and pressing reason why, this time, when he'd somehow managed to get so much further than ever before, to the point where the bloody woman was prepared to talk to him, listen to him, buy him ham rolls, where she regarded him as a close enough friend to confide her wonderful news to him, there had to be some reason why an anarcho-socialist mud-fondler should suddenly appear out of thin air and whisk the object of his devotion away to Denmark Hill and the darkness that lay beyond, suddenly and conclusively drowning all his hopes like kittens in a bucket. Very well. He had faith. He believed that it was all for the best, that 1,000,000 generations of single-cell life forms had given their lives to make it that way. But it'd be nice if someone, not necessarily Mr. Darwin in person, but someone from his department, a junior assistant secretary or something, would take the time to drop by at some point and explain it all to him, in terms he could understand. It wasn't much to ask. Simple courtesy. Instead, he got Goblins, and Mr. Tanner, and Bauxite, and the Institute of Practical and Effective Sorcerers. Nobody, not Darwin's best friend, not even God's mother, could tell him that this was any way to run a universe. The only conclusion Paul could possibly draw was that the whole operation had gone to cock, and 1 billion years of mutating plankton would be entirely justified in asking for their money back. And, on top of that, the milk had gone off. At any other time, he'd have shrugged and gone to the shop for a more recent version. Not this time. because now he knew that the same agency that had microengineered the intricate hydraulics of his heart had hand-reared the bacteria that were currently making whoopee in his hardly touched pint of semi-skimmed, and, once again, he couldn't help but take it personally. He'd been chosen by Darwin and destiny to scry bauxite, to fall in love with girls who preferred performance potters, to take part in this bizarre rat-in-a-maze experiment. The least he could expect was milk without great big chunks of cheese floating in it. Not good enough, he decided, and he wasn't standing for it. He gave the milk a ferocious scowl and snapped his fingers. The kettle boiled. He stared at it for a moment, and then he thought, well, I suppose you've got to get the hang of it first. Practice makes perfect and all that. He tried again, but this time he concentrated on the milk. Come on, milk, he thought. You know better than that. You want to end up getting tipped down the bog, fine. But wouldn't you rather do your job, fulfil your purpose, be the best carton of milk you possibly can? I can always get another pint of semi-skimmed, but as far as you're concerned, this is it. Now or never. Do you really want to go gurgling away into the dark sewers without even having tried? He snapped his fingers. Nothing happened. Fine, he thought, and he studied the milk for a moment, imagining what it'd be like to swim about inside it if he was no bigger than a milk molecule. He closed his eyes tight and visualized the curdled, knotted particles set upon by bacteria like Mexican peasants harassed by evil bandits. Then he could see it in his mind's eye on the mind screen. Quite suddenly, a little milky peasant stands up and defies the bacteria, and almost at once there's a terrific battle. The peons rushing their persecutors like a tidal wave, dragging them down from their horses, beating them to death with farm tools and pitching their butter corpses on the village midden. Eyes shut, he could see the clots and zits in the milk break up, the ghastly yellow fade into pure milk white. There was a smile on his face. He opened his eyes and looked down. No dice. A brief moment of panic, followed by simple aggravation, and he snapped his fingers as though he was kicking the spin dryer or thumping the photocopier. This hurts me more than it hurts you, but sometimes you've got to be cruel to be kind. Then, without bothering to look, he poured milk into his tea, stirred it, fished out the tea bag, and drank. It tasted just fine, as he'd known it would. It was at that moment that Paul realised the simple basic truth. The world ought to work properly. There was nothing wrong with it, but sometimes it stuck or it wouldn't start in the mornings. Magic was the confident, well-placed clout on the side of the casing, the clip around the carburettor that got it going. Magic wasn't changing the world or making it do impossible stuff. Magic was persuading it, by force of will and a little controlled violence, to stop fart-arsing about and get on with what it was supposed to be doing. Simple as that. Now that he'd figured that out, he had no trouble at all. It was dark and gloomy outside the window, just starting to spit with rain, but he soon fixed that with a neatly directed finger snap, and the sunlight switched itself on, and the cloud curtains were drawn and tied back, and the rain thought better of it and went away somewhere else. There was no bread, no sausages, no bacon, but that wasn't right, because a hard-working magician needed a good breakfast inside him before he could go setting the world to rights. One click of the fingers sorted out the supply foul up, another produced a perfect bacon sandwich. The dustbin needed emptying, and the ceiling was swathed in dusty wreaths of cobweb, but he was far too busy these days with his important work for the bauxite industry to be bothered with menial chores like dusting and trash haulage. A quick spot of thumb and middle finger action, and it was all taken care of. What was more, 3 dirty mugs he hadn't even noticed spontaneously washed and dried themselves and lined up to attention on the shelf over the sink. Dismissed, he told them. Carry on. Iron shirts materialised on hangers. Books left the floor and fell in the bookshelf. The dead light bulb in the bedside lamp came alive and glowed cheerfully. Situation normal. All systems nominal. Just like a bunch of badly behaved kids in the street. All they want is for someone to tell them what to do. And then he thought. That was all very well, but how could a busy, hard-working bauxite dowser like him be expected to give his full attention to his work when his heart was going pitter-patter like a bird with a broken wing, and his thoughts kept turning to the only girl he'd ever really loved, getting up to God knew what in a derelict bus in a field near Esher with a performance-potting jailbird? Too much to expect of anybody, let alone a sensitive, fragile sensibility like his. Obviously something had gone wrong here, and it needed fixing, so he'd snap his fingers, and then the phone would ring, and, well, we can take it from there, okay? Fine. Paul snapped his fingers. 2 pairs of used socks vanished from the floor and reappeared in his underwear drawer, crisply ironed and neatly balled. A broken pencil on the mantelpiece sharpened itself. Apart from that, nothing. Of course, it would have helped if it had fallen, but when he looked around the room, there was a dinky little 5th-generation Motorola lying on the bed. He checked to see it was fully charged up and switched on. Then he snapped his fingers again. Nothing. He sagged and dropped into his chair, which had somehow contrived to move from over by the door to directly under his bum without him noticing. So much for that theory, then. What the hell use was magic if all it could achieve was a little light housework and some entry-level shopping? Any bloody fool can wash up or shift furniture. The fact that he carried out these tasks by snapping his fingers rather than the more conventional methods was neither here nor there. Magic didn't work, after all. It couldn't set right the fundamental lash-ups of the cosmos. It was like having a car with a fully functional CD player and a buggered engine. Useless. The hell with it. The phone rang. Paul jumped up out of his chair like a space shuttle bursting out of the Earth's gravity well. "Hello?" "Listen." He recognised the voice. It wasn't the voice he'd wanted it to be. He sat down on the bed and closed his eyes. "I need you here in the office, right now," Mr. Tanner went on. "Don't waste time putting a suit on or anything like that. Get yourself over here right away." Before he could say anything such as, for example, "get lost," the line went dead. Scowling, he aimed the phone at the wall opposite, but didn't actually let fly. It occurred to him that maybe it wasn't him who'd magicked the phone out of thin air, but rather Mr. Tanner, in which case, if he smashed it to bits, he might get in trouble. He shoved it in his pocket, grabbed his coat, and hurried out into the street. Saturday. Different bus timetable. He stood at the curb, waiting to cross the road to the bus stop. But before he could do that, a taxi pulled up next to him and the door swung open. "Paul Carpenter?" "Yes," he replied. "Hop in." He frowned. "But I haven't got enough money," he said. "Don't worry about that. Charge to the firm J.W.Wells, right?" Paul nodded and climbed in. All he could see of the driver was the back of his head, a cross between Yoda and one of the PG Dip's chimps. Wonderful, he thought. I'm being driven across London by a goblin, and my mum reckoned I'd never amount to anything. The journey hardly seemed to take any time at all, and as soon as he climbed out of the taxi, the door slammed shut, and it drove away, leaving him standing outside 70 St. Mary Axe. He was wondering how he was going to get inside when the door opened about 20 degrees and a goblin face appeared. He didn't think he recognised it. This one was more sort of warthog come peccary with matching tusks. The goblin beckoned to him, and then, as they passed in the doorway, bowed deeply. That, he felt, was something he'd probably never get used to. "You took your bloody time." Mr. Tanner was sitting on the front desk in more or less exactly the same place and position as he'd been when Paul had left the office on Friday night. "Still, at least you're here now. Take a look at these. Ring anything that gives you the twitch, and green marker pen." He slid a folder of large, glossy prints across the desk. All landscapes, aerial views of desert, the same old stuff. Paul started to feel more than a little sceptical about the urgency in all this. "You still here?" Mr. Tanner was looking at him over the top of his glasses. "If you're wondering how you're going to get to your office with a place full of goblins, don't worry about it. Leave them alone and they won't give you any bother." Paul left Mr. Tanner in reception. He appeared to be reading a newspaper, and climbed the stairs to his office. No goblins anywhere to be seen, but no shortage of signs that they'd been there recently, from ripped carpet and claw-shredded wallpaper to axe-riven door panels and the occasional dark, foul-smelling brown stain on the floor. It'd take a dozen men 6 months to clean up and make good all that mess, but Paul knew better than that. A few finger clicks were all it'd take, and nobody would ever guess there'd been anything on the premises larger or more destructive than a gerbil. Just as well, Paul thought, as he sat down behind his desk, that my social and personal life were a complete fuck-up and I wasn't just about to go out or anything. Even so, it was a bit much being ordered back into the office on a Saturday morning. Was this sort of thing going to happen all the time, for the rest of his working life? Now there was a cheerful thought. Never mind, he reassured himself. The quicker he started, the sooner he'd be finished. He went through the pile of enlargements, waiting to feel the electric shock effect. But either he'd lost the knack, or else there wasn't anything there in the first place, not so much as a tiny twitch. That wasn't so hot, he reckoned. Probably it was because he wasn't doing it right, maybe because his mind was on other things. It didn't take much imagination to picture Mr. Tanner scowling at him as he handed back a wad of pristine photos, telling him to go away and do it again, properly this time. Well, he thought, he could cheat, drawing a handful of squiggles here and there at random. Mr. Tanner wouldn't know he was lying. Then he thought, better still, if he could persuade Tanner that he was rubbish at his job, maybe Tanner would decide Paul hadn't got the touch after all, and he'd let him quit. He uncapped the green marker pen, closed his eyes and prodded with a fingertip. Where his finger landed, literally in the middle of nowhere, he carefully drew a green circle, then moved on to the next one. It didn't take him long to do the whole stack, and as soon as he'd done the last one, the door swung open and in came Mr. Tanner, with another blue folder under his arm, and a teacup and a plate of what looked like purple iced Christmas cake in his hands. "Any luck?" Mr. Tanner asked. "No, yes, actually I'm not sure." Mr. Tanner looked at him. "Thought you could probably do with a cup of tea," he said. "Also," he added, "it's my birthday. Mum baked me a cake." He put the plate down on Paul's desk. "For me?" Paul asked. "Don't eat it if you don't want it," Mr. Tanner replied. "Anyhow, here's some more pics for you to have a look at. I'll take these other ones on if you're done with them." Paul hesitated. "Like I said," he stammered, "I'm not sure about them. I could have got them all completely wrong." Mr. Tanner shrugged. "Nobody's perfect," he said. "We all make mistakes. Just so long as you've done your best, that's all anyone can ask." Before Paul could say anything, he scooped up the old photos with their entirely spurious green rings, conspicuous as acne on the face of a supermodel, and put them under his arm. "I'll let you get on," he said. "After all, expect you got things you'd rather be doing." He paused at the door and added, "By the way, I appreciate you coming in like this on a Saturday on such short notice. I'll be honest with you, there's been times since you joined us when I wondered if you'd got what it takes, attitude-wise. I'm glad you proved me wrong." Paul listened to his footsteps in the corridor until they died away and then said, "Fuck," rather loudly. Anything else he could probably have coped with, but gratitude was too much to bear. He nearly jumped up and ran after Mr. Tanner to confess his sins and get rid of the guilt, but he was too scared and ashamed. A small part of him tried to argue that this was just another of Mr. Tanner's mind games, nastier even than the zombie magic. But even though he was pretty sure this theory was true, it didn't make him feel any less guilty. He sipped the tea, which was lukewarm and at least 40% pure sugar, and looked at the slice of cake. The idea of goblin cuisine didn't appeal to him one bit, but there was the dreadful problem of disposing of the body. If he just left it there and Mr. Tanner saw it, untouched, or if he slung it in the bin, even worse. Eating it, on the other hand, was something he really wasn't prepared to do. It was too big to fit in his coat pocket. With a sigh, he pulled open the bottom drawer of the desk, intending to hide the slice there until Monday, when he could return with a suitable container in which to smuggle it off the premises. He'd had the bottom drawer open only yesterday, and he could have sworn that at that time it had been empty. Now there was something in it. 3 things. One was the long stapler, but Paul was used to finding that lurking in unexpected places. The second was a bag of chocolate-covered raisins. The third was a cardboard tube, more or less the same length as the inner core of a toilet roll, but thicker. He frowned, took the roll out, laid it on the desk, and poked up it with the butt end of a pencil. Something had slid out. It looked like a rolled-up black dustbin liner, but when he unfolded it, he recognised it as the funny sheet thing he'd found in the strong room and briefly described as an Acme portable door before losing his nerve and changing it to something less facetious. At least, that was what he took it for at first, because the markings, apparently representing the panels, hinges and handle of a door, looked at first sight to be the same. On closer examination, he reckoned they were in fact slightly different. An 8-sided doorknob instead of a round one, for example, and rather more detailed mouldings surrounding each pseudo-panel. He studied it for a moment, then shrugged, rolled it up and put it back. Rather more interesting was the bag of raisins. Chocolate raisins were far and away Paul's favourite form of recreational nibbling. Once he'd opened a bag, his hand would insist on straying back to it until the very last raisin had gone, generally leaving him feeling bloated and sick. This bag, he couldn't help noticing, was still sealed. That tempted him. Although what little residues of the basic human survival instinct that remained to him argued vehemently against eating anything he found on the premises, it seemed reasonable to assume that if the bag was still pristine and inviolate, it wasn't just the leftovers of a goblin snack. "Go on," whispered the voice of temptation. "Just have 1 or 2. They can't hurt you." It did occur to him that it was something of a coincidence that a bag of his favourite sweeties should manifest itself in his desk drawer, just when his guilt and general misery left him most vulnerable to the siren lure of comfort eating. But by then he was no longer in complete control of his actions. He hadn't noticed himself opening the bag, but it was none the less open. 3 or 4 brownly gleaming raisins had spilled out and were lying on the desk in front of him, pretty well clamouring to be popped into his mouth. His preferred method was to tuck the raisin into the corner of his mouth until the chocolate coating melted, before biting the sugary heart of the raisin itself. The hell with it, he thought, and by the time he'd put the slice of purple cake in the drawer and slammed it shut, he was already on his second raisin and reaching for a third. It didn't take him long to reach the conclusion that he'd done the right thing. They weren't just yummy, these raisins. They were super double plus yummy with a yummy chaser. He dug his fingers into the packet and scooped out a half handful, cramming them into his mouth like a small child, and for quite some time all he could think about was how gorgeous they tasted. In fact, it was only when he realised that half the packet seemed to have gone that he made an effort and steered his hand. Time, he decided regretfully, to start thinking about rationing what was left. He put the packet back in the drawer, closed it firmly and wedged it shut with his knee. And now, he told himself, you'd better get some work done, unless you want to stay here till Monday morning. He reached for the nearest photo and immediately felt the by now familiar tingling, starting at his fingertips and running all the way down to the base of his wrist. Pay dirt. His first thought was dismay. If the scrying magic was working absolutely fine again, maybe there hadn't been anything wrong with it to begin with, and he'd drawn a blank on the first batch of photos simply because there were quite genuinely hadn't been anything there to find. He elbowed the thought out of his mind, drew a green circle, and reached for the next picture. Instead, his fingers found the raisin packet. Weirder and weirder, since his knee was still jammed against the drawer. Still, he knew from long, dyspeptic experience that chalky raisins don't just sit there waiting for you, like cowboys holed up behind a barricade of wagons as a Sioux raiding party appears over the skyline. They sneak out like pale, insubstantial wraiths and find their way into hand and mouth. Simple confectioner's magic, the sort that happens every day. Nothing to worry, munch about. He examined and marked 4 or 5 more pictures, each time feeling the scrying buzz. At least he was doing it properly this time, which he hoped would go some way towards making up for his childish and unprofessional behaviour with the first batch. If only. He looked up, suddenly aware that he wasn't alone in the room. A goblin was standing on the other side of the desk, looking at him through tiny, traffic-light red round eyes. Before he'd even had a chance to jump out of his skin, the goblin opened his mouth and screamed at him. It was exactly the same scream as he'd heard yesterday. The subtle blend of minor bird and monkey. This time, however, he realised he could understand it. "Hello," the goblin was saying. He wasn't translating or anything like that. He hadn't suddenly learned goblin language without realising. Rather, it was as if the goblin was being dubbed into English, and the dubbed voice was coming from somewhere inside his head. Weird as square eggs, but somehow he wasn't as taken aback as he would have been under the circumstances. "Did you like the cake?" the goblin was saying, and that triggered something in his mind. This was the goblin he'd fought in reception, the one whose hand he'd stapled. In other words, Mr. Tanner's mother. He replied, and he wasn't screaming. He was talking English, but the goblin seemed to understand. Yes, it was great, very nice." The goblin nodded and bared her teeth. She had 9 of them, all very long and sharp. "Liar," she said. "You've never even touched it. It's there in your desk drawer." "Ah," Paul said. "And don't say you weren't hungry," the goblin went on, "because you've been stuffing sweets all morning. Doesn't bother me," she added, "but if you can't bear to touch my cake, at least don't lie about it. Took me hours to make that. I'm not a ruddy servant, I hope you realise." The only reply he could think of at that moment was, "Sorry," so he said it. "Quite all right," the goblin replied, still a trifle stiff, but not nearly as bad as before. "Yeah, actually, it's probably just as well. The icing's puree of rat liver whisked up with spider's eggs and a dab of creme fraiche. You wouldn't have liked that, with your sweet tooth." Paul nodded slowly. "Wasted on me, I'm afraid," he said. "Years," the goblin said. "Well, give it here, then. Waste not, want not." Paul opened the desk and took out the slice of cake. The goblin snatched it from his hand and swallowed it in one gulp, like a performing seal eating fish in midair. "In case you were wondering," she said with her mouth full, "those weren't just ordinary chalky raisins." Paul nodded. He'd guessed that already. The goblin laughed. At least she screeched, and Paul heard a laugh inside his head. "You want to go easy on the rest of them, mind. They're not actually raisins, see?" "Ah." The goblin shook her head. "Actually," she said, "they're dragon droppings, very expensive and rare." Paul felt his insides making a determined effort to become outsides. "Chocolate-covered dragon droppings," he croaked. "Not chocolate-covered," the goblin corrected him. "Tastes like chocolate, of course, only better. But it's not just the flavour, see, it's the—" Her last screech was untranslatable. That was, he heard it in clear, and no equivalent word passed through his mind. "Sorry?" he said. The goblin paused, as though searching for a synonym. "Magic," she said. "Special with dragons. You get the same effect drinking their blood, only then it's permanent. With droppings, it only lasts an hour or so. Still, you ask yourself what you'd rather do, cut a dragon's throat or fool around after it with a dustpan and brush." "Oh, I'm sorry," Paul said. What exactly do they do? These—" "Oh, of course you don't know," the goblin grinned, just like her son. "They make you understand. Like, if you eat one, you can understand languages you've never learned. Well, like you're doing now. Also," she went on, "and this is the really good bit, although it can be a real pain sometimes, also, when people tell you lies, you hear what they say, but inside your head you hear what they're really saying. If you follow me, I'll give you an example. Hang on." The goblin paused for thought, and then— The sound Paul heard was a shrill yell, totally inhuman. The words he heard were, "I'm sorry I attacked you yesterday, and I deserve to get my hand stapled." But at the back of his mind, in the dark corner where he couldn't even lie to himself, he heard, "Like hell I'm sorry, you smooth-skinned tall git. See what I mean?" she added. Oh, Paul said. I see. That's a very good reason for not gulping 'em down a handful at a time," the goblin said. "Quite apart from you'll spoil your dinner and end up fat as a pig. Still," she went on, "it's just a little present sort of thing, by way of saying sorry for trying to kill you." "Bullshit. Dennis made me give them to you. Don't know what he's up to, but you want to watch yourself. Sly bugger he is, taking us so is that." Thank you," Paul said. "That's all right," drop dead. "Anyway," she went on, "mustn't keep you from your work, and this time, mind you do it properly. Drawing green squiggles at random isn't what you're paid for. Remember?" Paul winced. You know about that," the goblin giggled, or at least the candied dragon turd in his bloodstream translated the noise she made as a giggle. "Do me a favour," she said. "When I was a kid, we had dragon black pudding for breakfast, straight from the pan. Bloody delicious it was. Anyway, you can't fool me." "Apparently not," Paul muttered. "I suppose you're going straight to Mr. your son, and tell him." "No! What do you think, you snoutless clown? But he wouldn't care anyhow. He can tell the difference between a random squiggle and the real deal. He's not thick." "Ah," Paul said. "Well, thanks anyway." The goblin shrugged, but didn't move. "Well, get on with it then," she said. "Or are you like all them other humans? Can't perform when there's someone watching?" It was the way she said it, rather than any input from the unseen translator, that made Paul feel slightly sick. "What I mean is," he said lamely, "I'm sure you've got lots of things you want to be doing, so don't feel like you've got to keep me company or anything." "Liar. You think I'm horrible and you want me to piss off." "Well," Paul admitted, "yes." "Fair enough." The goblin headed for the door. "If you don't want to hear the other thing I was going to tell you, that's fine. No scales off my nose." Paul decided that trying to keep up in a point-scoring match with Mr. Tanner's mum was almost certainly beyond him, and he couldn't be bothered anyway. "What other thing?" he asked. She sniffed. "Oh, you really don't want to know. Besides, I'm horrible, so why should I tell you?" Paul frowned. Then he remembered the great magic, the one his father had taught him. "Please," he said. "That's more like it," the goblin said. "All right, here you go. Close your eyes, then open them when I tell you. Not before, mind. All right." Paul wasn't at all sure about that, but he did as he was told. After about 10 seconds, the goblin said, Now, and he opened his eyes. He found that he was looking directly into what he took at first to be an old-fashioned, a present from Letty, glass paperweight, the sort that was round and contained a nondescript scrap of plastic seaweed or something equally delightful. Then, whatever it was started to glow with an offensively bright light. Before he could turn his head, however, he heard the goblin say, "You know you don't. If you look away, it won't work." So he narrowed his eyes and tried to ignore the full-blown headache that was getting nicely underway in his right temple. Just when he reckoned he'd had enough, the light abruptly cut out, and in the centre of the glass ball, surrounded by what looked like a snowy day in Saskatchewan, he could see tiny dots moving about against a green background. "Bloody interference," the goblin said apologetically. "Personally, I blame satellite TV. Really screws things up when you're in the middle of a scene and suddenly all you get is reruns of On the Buses." "It's a crystal ball," Paul said aloud. "Yes, and I'm a smurf. This is a genuine seer stone, you ignorant twat. Now, look carefully. I can't keep this up all day." So Paul looked, and the harder he concentrated, the bigger and clearer the scene became. He could see a motorway. Beside it, wedged in between the arms of two access roads, a scrubby patch of grass. In the middle of the grass, an old single-decker bus, painted in alternate swathes of pink, canary yellow, and red oxide primer. Inside the bus, general squalor of the kind he'd always thought could only be created in a confined space. In the epicentre of the squalor, an ancient faded blue mattress. On the mattress, two pink people with no clothes on, one of whom he recognised. He closed his eyes. "Seen enough?" the goblin asked. "Yes," said Paul.